The war chamber was cold. It was always cold. The Keth High Council liked it that way. Cold rooms kept minds sharp and bodies uncomfortable, and uncomfortable bodies did not linger longer than necessary. Warlord Duvos stood at the far end of the obsidian table and did not sit. He had not been offered a seat, and he would not have taken one anyway. He was a soldier. Soldiers stood. He had 8 planetary subjugations behind him. 300 years of service to the Keth Dominion. More campaigns won than most commanders ever saw in a full lifetime. His name alone had ended 2 wars before the first shot was fired, because the opposing side had heard his name and done the math. Archon Veth Saran slid the assignment brief across the table. Duvos picked it up. He read it once, slowly, the way he read all orders, carefully, with full attention, missing nothing. The chamber was quiet except for the low hum of the atmospheric processors. The 6 council members watched him read. He set the brief back down on the table. He slid it back. The chamber went very still. Veth Saran looked at the brief sitting in the middle of the table between them. He looked at it for a long moment. Then he looked up at Duvos. "You understand," he said, "what you are doing." "Yes," Duvos said. "This could be interpreted as refusal of a direct council order." "Yes," Duvos said again. One of the other council members leaned forward. Her name was Councillor Poth, and she had been in her seat for 400 years, and she had seen things that would stop the hearts of lesser beings. She was not easily surprised. She looked surprised now. "Duvos," she said, "you have never refused an assignment." "No," he agreed. "I have not." "Then explain yourself." Duvos looked at the brief on the table. He did not pick it up again. He had read it once, and that was enough. He would not be reading it a second time. "I have 300 years left in my natural lifespan," he said. "I have 8 campaigns behind me. I have a house on the second coast of Kelvareth, where the tide comes in twice a day and the water is the color of old copper." He paused. "I intend to see that water again." Veth Saran's voice was flat. "You are afraid." Duvos did not flinch. He had been called a great many things in 300 years of service. Afraid was not one of them. But he did not argue the point because the honest answer was more complicated than a simple denial. And he was too old and too tired for complicated answers in cold rooms. "I have read the xenographic files," he said. "All of them. Not the summary, the full record, the Vorrigan engagement, the Drax incident, the Keleth summit." He looked at Veth Saran directly. "I have read what comes back from the humans, and I have read what does not come back. And I am telling you as the most decorated commander in this Dominion's living history, that whoever you send to do this job, I am sorry for them." He picked up his command seal from the table. He held it for a moment, then set it down in front of Veth Saran. "My resignation," he said, "is effective immediately." He left. The doors closed behind him. The chamber was very quiet. Poth looked at the command seal on the table. She looked at the assignment brief. Then she looked at Veth Saran, who was sitting with his 12 fingers flat on the table surface, and his expression doing something she had not seen it do in 400 years of working beside him. "Second choice," she said. Veth Saran nodded slowly. He reached for the communicator. The second name on the list was Warlord Isath. She was younger than Duvos by a century, sharper in some ways, colder in others. She had won the Pelion border campaign in 11 days, when the Council's best estimate had been 4 months. She did not lose. She had never lost. She was, by any reasonable measure, one of the most dangerous military minds in the known galaxy. She arrived at the war chamber 40 minutes later. She did not sit either. The assignment brief was still on the table. Veth Saran slid it to her. She read it standing, and her eyes moved across the document with the quick, clean precision of someone who had been reading tactical briefs for 2 centuries. She reached the end. She went back to the beginning and read one section again. Then she set it down. She did not slide it back. She simply let go of it and stepped away from the table, the way a person steps away from something that has burned them. "No," she said. Poth made a sound that was not quite a word. Isath looked at her. "I have read about the Vorrigan engagement," she said. 43 ships. They sent 43 ships to a colony held by fewer than 800 humans." She paused. 3 came back. "We are aware," Poth began. 3, Isath said again. The word sat in the room. "I have run the numbers. I have run them 6 different ways. There is no tactical model that produces that outcome, not against any other species in this galaxy. And that was 800 humans defending a colony with agricultural equipment and whatever they had in their pockets." She looked at Veth Saran. "What you are describing in that brief is not a military operation. It is an execution, and I am the one being executed. You would have resources. It does not matter what resources I have." Her voice was quiet. That was the worst part. She was not angry. She was not frightened, or at least she was not showing it. She was just certain in the clean, flat way that experienced soldiers were certain about things they had already fully thought through. "I have spent 2 days studying the human military doctrine since I first heard this assignment was being considered. Their response times, their resource conversion, the way they fight when they have nothing left." She picked up her own command seal. She set it on the table beside the brief. "I am the best military commander this council has at its disposal. I know that. You know that. And I am telling you, as the best, that it cannot be done. Not by me. Not by anyone." She left. The doors closed. The brief sat on the table between the 2 command seals. Veth Saran sat for a long time without speaking. He was 600 years old. He had managed the rise and fall of 3 different galactic powers. He had brokered treaties that reshaped the known universe and overseen wars that had ended civilizations. He was not a being who was easily made to feel small. He pulled the assignment brief toward him. He opened the attached xenographic files himself, which was something a high archon did not do. That work was for analysts and aides and the layers of bureaucracy that existed precisely so that people like Veth Saran never had to look at raw data. He read for a long time. The chamber was still cold. The processors hummed. Outside, the Dominion moved through its ordinary business, the great machinery of 600 years of rule turning on its established tracks, undisturbed. Inside the chamber, Veth Saran read about 3 ships returning from 43. He read about an 11-minute response time from a fleet that should not have existed. He read the deposition of a Vorrigan survivor who had gone silent for 47 seconds before saying very quietly that the human commander had looked bored. He read the name in the margin of that deposition, Dana Holt. He closed the file. He sat in the dark room. He thought about Duvos, walking out of this chamber with his command seal already in his hand before he even set it on the table. Already decided. Not afraid, not exactly. Just done with the arithmetic. Veth Saran was beginning to understand the arithmetic. He did not sleep that night. The files were old. Some of them were 7 years old, and some were 4, and some were only 2. But in the way that mattered, they were all ancient. They were the kind of records that changed the shape of things permanently. Before them, the galaxy had one understanding of humanity. After them, it had another. The line between before and after was sharp and clean and could not be uncrossed. Veth Saran read them in order. The first record was labeled the Vorrigan Engagement. 7 years ago, the Vorrigan Collective had decided to make a point. They were not a small power. They held 11 systems, maintained a fleet of considerable size, and had been expanding their territory along the outer rim for the better part of 2 decades without anyone stopping them. The human colony in their path was not a military installation. It was a farming settlement on a rocky planet with a thin atmosphere and not much else going for it, except that it sat in the middle of a transit corridor the Vorrigan wanted. They sent 43 ships. It was not cruelty exactly. It was efficiency. 43 ships was enough to make the outcome certain and fast, which was the merciful way to do it, if you were in the business of finding mercy in such things. The engagement was expected to take 36 hours. The human colony had no fleet. It had 812 people, a defensive perimeter designed to stop wildlife, and a man named Colonel Nate Voss, who had arrived on the colony 6 weeks earlier on what was officially logged as a routine inspection tour. It was not a routine inspection tour. The sensor logs from the Vorrigan fleet, which the Keth Dominion had obtained through back channels after the fact, showed the first 4 days clearly. The colonial defense held. Not easily. There were casualties. The perimeter was pushed. 2 of the outer stations were destroyed. But it held. By day 4, the Vorrigan commander had sent his first request for additional support, which the collective had declined on the grounds that 43 ships against 800 farmers was not a situation that required additional support. By day 6, and the logs showed the humans doing something with the colony's agricultural processing facilities that the Keth analysts who reviewed the footage could not name. They had sent the footage to 3 separate departments. None of them could name it either. One analyst wrote in the margin, "They appear to be building something. We do not know what. It is large." By day 8, the Vorrigan commander's support requests had become considerably less formal in their language. By day 11, 3 ships came back. The Keth Dominion had requested access to the Vorrigan survivor depositions as part of a standard post-engagement intelligence review. Most of the survivors described the engagement in tactical terms. Positions lost, systems damaged, the sequence of decisions that led to the retreat. They were soldiers' accounts. Dry, factual, useful. One deposition was different. The officer in question had been the Vorrigan fleet's second in command. He was not injured. He was physically intact when he came before the Keth debriefers, which meant the thing in his eyes was not the result of pain or blood loss. The debriefers had seen soldiers come back from bad engagements before. They noted in the session record that this was not the same thing. They asked him to describe the human commanding officer. He said the name, Colonel Nate Voss. They asked him to describe Voss. The deposition record showed a 47-second silence. Then the officer said, "He looked bored." The Keth debriefers had written in the session margin, "Subject showed acute stress response on mention of the name. Recommend no further questioning on this subject." They had added, and in smaller writing below that, "We did not ask a follow-up question. We did not want to." The name Dana Holt appeared in a margin note on the final page of the engagement file, written by an analyst who had cross-referenced the colonial roster. She had arrived at the colony 2 weeks before Voss. She was listed as a logistics coordinator. The analyst had written her name and then drawn a small line under it, the kind of line a person draws when they want to remember something but are not yet sure why. Veth Saran moved to the second file. The Drax border incident was smaller in scale and larger in implication. The Drax were a cautious species. They did not take unnecessary risks. When they decided to probe human response capabilities by staging a raid on a human transport vessel in a lightly monitored sector, they understood it as a precise intelligence gathering exercise. Send a small force, make contact, withdraw, measure the response. It was how things were done. Every advanced military civilization did it. It was considered polite, almost, compared to the alternatives. The response arrived in 11 minutes. Not a patrol vessel, not a single ship intercept, a fleet, a full combat-ready fleet, coming out of a jump point that the Drax had no record of, from a direction that had nothing on any chart. The Drax filed the sensor data with their own analysts, who ran the numbers and came back with an arithmetic error. They ran them again. Still an error. They ran them a third time and called a senior review because the numbers could not be right. Because the numbers implied a human deep space installation in a location that was nowhere near any mapped human territory, which meant either the charts were wrong or the humans had built something without telling anyone. The charts were not wrong. The Dracs filed a formal grievance with the nearest neutral mediating body, registered their objection to what they called disproportionate response posture, and quietly and permanently discontinued their border probe program where human territory was concerned. The Keth analyst who had filed the incident report had added a single note at the bottom. The human installation in question still has not been officially acknowledged. We do not know how many such installations exist. We have not asked. We are not sure we want the answer. The third file was the Keleth Summit. 2 years ago, a Keth-mediated negotiation over mineral rights in a disputed system near the human outer rim. The Pelian sovereignty held 3 times humanity's military tonnage at the time and had solid diplomatic ties to the Dominion. The mediation was designed, by all reasonable expectation, to produce an outcome favorable to the Pelian. This was not bias. It was simply the math of the situation. The side with more ships generally did better at the table. Commander Dana Holt represented humanity. She arrived early. She brought 2 aides and a thermos of coffee, and she sat on the human side of the table with the relaxed posture of someone who had already finished the work she needed to do and was waiting for everyone else to catch up. The summit lasted 4 hours. The Pelian envoy left with a settlement that was, by any measure, significantly less than what they had come with. The Keth mediators spent the following week reviewing the transcripts trying to find the exact moment the negotiation had turned. They could not find it. One mediator wrote, "It did not turn. It was never going in the direction we thought it was." Another wrote, "She was smiling the entire session. Not a friendly smile. The kind of smile that knows something." The Pelion envoy, in a private communication obtained by Keth intelligence, wrote to his superior council a single line that Veth Saran now read in the Cold War chamber, with the files spread open before him. "Do not sit across a table from this woman. There is no version of that conversation that ends the way you expect." Veth Saran closed the last file. Outside the chamber, the Dominion continued. Ships moved, councils met. Our trade continued along established routes. The machinery of 6 centuries of power turned without interruption. Inside the chamber, the most powerful political mind in the Keth Dominion sat very still and thought about 3 ships coming home from 43 and a fleet arriving from nowhere in 11 minutes, and a woman with a thermos of coffee who had walked out of a summit with everything she came for. He thought about Duvos, sliding the command seal across the table without being asked. Already decided. He was beginning to understand why. Solvath was not stupid. That was important to understand. Stupid beings made mistakes born from ignorance, and ignorance was forgivable. What Solvath did, he did with full information and a clean mind. And that was a different kind of mistake entirely. The kind that does not come from not knowing, but from knowing and deciding that the knowing was wrong. He had read the files, all of them. The Vorrigan engagement, the Drax incident, the Keleth summit. He had read the depositions and the analyst notes and the margin comments from the debriefers who had gone home and not slept well afterward. He had read all of it, and arrived at a conclusion that was different from the one the council had arrived at, and from the one that Duvos and Isath had arrived at. And the difference was this. Solvath believed that fear made stories grow. 3 ships come back from 43, and by the time the story travels far enough, 43 becomes 100 and 3 ships becomes 1. A fleet responds in 11 minutes, and by the time it reaches the council chamber, it was 5 minutes and the fleet was bigger. Fear was a lens, he believed, and it made things look larger than they were. He had seen it his entire career. He had used it when it suited him. He knew the mechanism. The human legend was fear, doing what fear always did. He picked his target carefully, a small installation on the outer rim, a monitoring post, essentially, a cluster of sensor arrays and a support facility, lightly staffed, routine posting. Nothing strategic. Nothing that anyone would send their best people to. The kind of place where soldiers went who needed to fill time before a real assignment. He told no one in the council. He was not under the council's authority directly. His faction maintained operational independence, as a privilege that had been earned over 4 generations of Dominion service. He told his fleet commander and his 2 senior lieutenants, and he told them it was a probe, a clean test of the legend. He genuinely believed that was what it would be. Private Owen Carr was 22 years old and 7 months into his first deployment when the alert came in. He was on level 3 of the monitoring post, sitting in a chair that had developed a squeak that no amount of adjustment had fixed, with his 3rd cup of coffee of the shift going cold beside him. He had been thinking about the food fabricator on level 4, which had a setting labeled Comfort Meal 7 that produced something in the approximate neighborhood of a cheeseburger if you did not look at it too critically and ate it fast enough. And the alert did not give him time to finish the thought. The lights in the corridor changed color. Not the normal shift change amber. The emergency red, which Owen had seen in drills but not outside of them. The sound that came with it was a sound he had heard in training enough times that his body knew what it meant before his mind had fully processed it, and his body was already moving before the 2nd alarm cycle completed. The corridor looked different in red. Everything had edges it did not normally have. The air felt thinner. Owen's hands were doing things with the equipment at his station, the correct things, the things the training had put into his hands, while the part of his brain that was still 22 and from Indiana was noting, somewhat distantly, that this was happening and that it was real, and that the gap between real and training was much narrower than he had expected, which was either reassuring or the opposite of reassuring, and he did not have time to decide which. He went to his position. The post had 61 personnel. It was not designed for heavy combat. The defensive systems were solid but not exceptional. What it had, beyond the equipment, was the fact that all 61 people had been trained by people who had been trained by people who had come up through a specific military tradition that had been shaped over generations by the specific requirements of human biology and human psychology. Which was to say, it had been shaped by the fact that humans were, at their baseline, animals that had survived on a difficult planet by being extremely good at not dying when everything in the environment wanted them to. This was not a thing that showed up in the Keth xenographic files. Solvath's force hit the installation at the 3:40 mark of the local shift cycle. The first 6 minutes were close. Owen was in the East Corridor, and the East Corridor was loud in ways that corridors were not supposed to be loud, and there was a moment somewhere around the 4-minute mark where the part of him that was afraid ran out of room because something else had moved in and taken up all the available space. And afterward he would not have a good word for what that something else was, only that it felt less like bravery and more like a kind of simple focusing. On the way a camera lens focuses and everything outside the frame goes soft and meaningless. He did what he had been trained to do. At the 6-minute mark, a voice came over the command channel, low, unhurried, not loud. The voice said 4 words. Owen's shoulders dropped. Not from relief, exactly. From the feeling of the world reorganizing around a fixed point. He did what the voice indicated, and he did not hesitate. Solvath's force lasted 19 minutes. Solvath ran the tactical replay in his command vessel afterward, watching it once, then going back to the beginning and watching it again. He was looking for the turn. The moment the engagement pivoted against him. He was looking for the error in his planning, the thing he had miscalculated, because there had to be a pivot point. Engagements had pivot points. That was how engagements worked. You found the turn and you understood the mistake, and then you knew what to do differently next time. There was no turn. He ran it a 3rd time. He watched the sensor data from the installation cameras, the ones his own intelligence system had accessed. He watched his forces moving through the engagement. He watched the human defenders moving through the same engagement from the other direction. He stopped the footage at the 8-minute mark. On the screen, a man was walking down a corridor. Not running, not crouching at the wall the way the tactical models said defenders moved in active engagements. Walking, unhurried, the way a person walked when they were going to get something they had forgotten from the next room. And the sensor data showed the corridor was active. There was fire in 2 of the adjacent sections. The building's pressure systems were spiking from a breach on the north side. The engagement was loud and close and real. The man walked like none of that was his problem. Solvath did not know the man's name from the footage. He would find out later that it was Colonel Nate Voss, and that Voss had been on a separate inspection tour, and that somehow, this lightly staffed monitoring post on the outer rim had, through a coincidence that did not feel like a coincidence, been in the vicinity of Nate Voss at the exact moment Solvath's probe arrived. He did not think about that yet. He was still watching the walk. He opened a channel to the Keth High Council. He told them he may have made an error in judgment. The channel was quiet for a long time. Veth Saran's voice arrived, quiet and careful, the way voices went when the person speaking was choosing every word with both hands. Veth Saran asked if Solvath had, at any point in the last 30 minutes, transmitted his vessel's position on any channel that the human command network could have intercepted. Solvath thought about it. He said he was not certain. Another silence. Longer this time. Veth Saran said, "Begin moving." Solvath began moving. He moved for a long time before he felt anything close to safe, and even then, he was not sure safe was the right word for what he felt. The diplomatic channel request went out from the Keth Dominion at the first hour of the standard cycle. Veth Saran sent it himself, which was not the normal procedure. Channel requests of this nature went through an aide, then a communications officer, then a protocol officer, and arrived at the relevant human desk somewhere between 4 and 7 hours after the initial request, depending on which human desk was involved and how many layers of bureaucracy stood between the request and the person who actually needed to receive it. The channel was open in 8 minutes. Veth Saran had noted the response time and said nothing about it to anyone, but he had noted it, and the noting of it sat in the back of his thoughts like a stone in a shoe, small, persistent, impossible to ignore once you were aware of it. The screen resolved and Dana Holt was there. She was not in a formal setting. She was in what appeared to be a small office, at the kind of office that existed purely to hold a desk and a chair and whatever you needed to have in front of you while you worked. The lighting was practical. She was wearing a plain gray shirt with no insignia, no rank markers, nothing official. Her hair was not arranged into anything formal. She had a cup of something hot, coffee, almost certainly, and she was holding it in both hands the way a person held something hot when they were using the warmth as much as the contents. She looked tired. Not the tired of someone who had been awake all night dealing with a crisis. The tired of someone who had been awake all night and had already finished dealing with the crisis and was now waiting to hear what the other side wanted to say about it. Veth Saran opened with the formal diplomatic language. He had been using formal diplomatic language for 600 years, and he was very good at it. He acknowledged the incident. He confirmed that Commander Solvath had acted without council authorization or knowledge. He provided documentation. He had prepared it carefully before opening the channel, confirming Solvath's faction status and the specific terms under which the faction operated independently of council directive. He expressed formal regret for the injury of 3 human personnel and the structural damage to the installation. He used the right words in the right order. He had done this thousands of times. Holt sipped her coffee. She did not respond. He waited. The silence extended past the point where a response would normally come. In Keth diplomatic practice, A silence of this duration after a formal opening was a signal. It meant the other party was preparing a counterposition of significant weight, something that required time to frame properly. He waited a bit longer. "We know," she said. 2 words. She said them the way a person said something that did not require elaboration because both parties were already fully aware of the full context, and the elaboration would just be noise. He waited for what came after the 2 words. Nothing came. He continued. He was not a being who was easily thrown by silences or short answers. 600 years of council work had prepared him for most conversational textures. He offered formal reparations. He offered the official censure of Solvath's faction with documentation. He offered a full review of the existing border monitoring treaty, and which could be revised to include additional buffer provisions along the outer rim. He laid it out cleanly and in the correct order, the way the protocol required. It was a solid offer. By any standard measure of this kind of diplomatic engagement, it was a generous offer. Holt let him finish. She set her coffee down. "Veth Saran," she said, "I want to show you something." She reached to one side and her screen shifted to a star map. It was a map of Keth Dominion space, rendered in human cartographic style. Slightly different projections from the Keth standard, slightly different color assignments, but unmistakably the Dominion. All 11 core systems. The outer territories, the deep space monitoring corridors, the internal transit lanes. 17 points were highlighted across the map, and they were distributed, not clustered at the human border, not concentrated in the contested outer rim. Distributed. Interior systems and exterior systems both. Deep territory and edge territory both. The spacing between them was not random. She gave him time to look at them. He looked. He recognized most of the system locations. He could name them. He knew what they contained. One of the points was positioned precisely at the coordinates of a Keth Deep Archive installation that did not appear in any public record. He had attended a briefing in that installation 4 days ago. He had traveled there through a transit corridor that had no official designation. He had been one of 6 beings who knew the installation existed. One of the other points sat in the middle of a monitoring corridor so deep in Keth interior space that sending a probe there would have required either a journey of several months through monitored territory or access to jump technology that the Dominion had specifically developed and specifically not shared with anyone. Vethsaran looked at the 17 points on the map. He looked at them for a long time. "What do those represent?" he asked. Holt's answer was simple. "Places we've already been," she said. The room was quiet. The sound Vethsaran's chair made when he leaned back in it was a small sound, but the room was quiet enough that it was the loudest thing in it. He thought about the Keth installation that did not exist in any public record. He thought about who had known about it, and who had not known about it, and who was apparently, by the evidence of the highlighted point on the map in front of him, aware of it anyway. He thought about a fleet arriving from nowhere in 11 minutes. He thought about the Keth analyst's note at the bottom of the Drax incident file. "We have not asked how many such installations exist. We are not sure we want the answer." He was beginning to understand what the analyst had meant. "Solvath made a mistake," Holt said. She picked up her coffee again. "Everybody makes mistakes. The documentation you provided looks genuine and we're prepared to accept it as such." She paused. "The 3 personnel who were injured are going to be fine." Another pause. "The installation is already being repaired." She looked at him over the rim of her coffee. Her expression was not unfriendly. It was not hard. When it was the expression of a person who had already finished the chess game and was sitting with you anyway, out of courtesy, while you worked out the last few moves for yourself. "I just wanted to make sure we were having the same conversation." She closed the channel. The screen went blank. Vethsaran sat in the empty channel room. The hum of the atmospheric processors was the only sound. The room was cold, as all Keth rooms were cold. He sat there for a long time. He thought about a 47-second silence in a deposition. He thought about a warlord setting his command seal on a table and walking away from 300 years of service without looking back. He thought about what the analyst had written about Dana Holt at the Keleth Summit. She was smiling the entire session. He thought about the smile on her face just before she closed the channel. He thought about those 17 points on the map, and about the 14 unnamed ones that were not the archive installation, and about how long they had been there, and about what other points might exist on a more complete map that she had not shown him. He thought about Izath, on her way out of the war chamber, looking back once and saying, "It cannot be done. Not by me, not by anyone." He thought, yes. He got up and went to find the council and tell them how the conversation had gone. He told them about the reparations acceptance and the treaty review agreement. He told them the formal parts, in the formal language, the way the protocol required. He did not tell them about the map. Some things, he had decided, and were better understood slowly. The aftermath was quiet. That was the thing about it that nobody talked about later. Not the size of it, not the weight of it, but the quiet. The universe had been braced for something loud, for some kind of declaration or demonstration, some proof that the legend was real and not just old soldiers making stories bigger than they were. The universe had been braced for a long time. What came was quiet. Solvath's faction lost 3 contested systems in the treaty revision. The terms were not punitive. They were, by any neutral observer's reading, quite fair. There was no cruelty in them, no excess. 3 systems, formally transferred, with a standard transition period, and provisions for relocation of Solvath-aligned personnel, and the kind of terms that got written up and filed and referenced in future negotiations as an example of clean diplomatic resolution. Solvath was alive. This was understood across the diplomatic channels and backroom conversations and the long corridors of every council chamber in Keth-adjacent space to be a choice, not a failure to act, not an oversight or a restraint born from weakness, a deliberate, considered, specific choice. Solvath had tested the legend, and the legend had responded by giving him his life back, neatly folded, like a thing being returned to its owner without comment. The choice communicated more than punishment would have. Solvath knew this. His faction council knew this. The 3 Keth Archons who reviewed the treaty terms knew this. Nobody said it directly. Nobody needed to. That the understanding moved through the relevant circles the way understanding moved when the lesson was obvious enough, silently, from person to person, with a minimum of words and a maximum of retention. Nobody suggested testing the matter a second time. Owen Carr received his reassignment orders 6 weeks after the engagement. He had been expecting them. The monitoring post was being upgraded, new personnel cycling in, standard rotation. He packed his things in the same bag he had packed them in when he arrived, a green canvas bag with a broken zipper pull that he had fixed with a piece of wire 7 months ago. He stood in the corridor outside his quarters for a moment before he moved on. The corridor looked different than it had before. Not physically. It was the same corridor, same gray panels, same inadequate lighting. But something about the way he moved through it had changed, and he was aware of the change the way you were aware of a healed cut, by the absence of the old feeling rather than the presence of a new one. He reported to his new posting. He was assigned to a forward patrol unit. He had 19 months left on his deployment, and a bag with a broken zipper pull, and the particular kind of quiet that settled into people who had been somewhere and come back. He did not think about the food fabricator anymore. The Keth Xenographic Division submitted a revised classification for humanity 3 months after the engagement and the subsequent diplomatic resolution. The previous classification had been a standard format entry, tier, threat assessment, diplomatic volatility rating, recommended engagement posture, a paragraph of contextual notes. Routine. The kind of entry that got updated periodically as new data came in and got filed in the relevant archive where it stayed until someone needed it. The analyst who drafted the revision had been with the Xenographic Division for 40 years. She had written hundreds of classification entries. She understood the format and the conventions and the specific way the language worked. Precise, neutral, neither inflating nor diminishing the subject. She had always found the work easy, not interesting particularly, but easy. She found this one difficult. She wrote the standard sections without much trouble. The data was clear and the format was clear, and the data fit the format without distortion. She wrote the tier assessment and the threat rating and the updated engagement posture recommendation. The engagement posture recommendation was simple. Do not engage. She wrote it in the neutral format, and it did not require much thought. The contextual notes section was harder. She started it 4 times. The first 3 attempts came out wrong, too large, too dramatic, reaching for words that did not quite fit the space they were supposed to fill. The 4th attempt she wrote in 3 words, and then sat looking at it for a long time. 3 words. They were accurate. They were not inflated. They said exactly what the data said, no more and no less, in the plainest language available. She entered them into the record. She closed the file. She did not reopen it. The retirement ceremony for Colonel Nate Voss was held on a Tuesday. Not a significant Tuesday, not the anniversary of anything, not a date with ceremony attached to it. Just a Tuesday in the middle of a regular week, in a gymnasium at a base in Northern Virginia where the ceiling was too high for the room, and the acoustic panels had never worked correctly, and the light from the windows went flat and gray in the afternoon the way it always went flat and gray in Virginia in November. There were folding chairs, 60, maybe 70 of them, set up in rows on the gymnasium floor with the particular slight crookedness that folding chairs always had when someone who was not a professional event coordinator set them up. They were almost full. Not quite. The coffee was from a machine in the hallway. It cost $1.75 and it tasted like the inside of the machine, which was not a good taste. People drank it anyway because that was what you did. Dana Holt gave the address. 4 sentences. She said where Voss had served and for how long and what those years had produced. Then she made a joke about the amount of paperwork he had generated over 31 years and whether the administrative office was still processing the final reports from the Vorrigan engagement, and the people in the folding chairs laughed. And Voss, standing at the front of the room with his hands behind his back, looked at the gymnasium floor, and the corner of his mouth moved in a direction that was not quite a smile but was adjacent to one. He accepted a folded flag. He accepted a handshake. He accepted a small plaque, the standard kind, the kind that came in a box with a foam interior, dark wood base, a metal face with engraved text, his name, his years of service, his rank. At the bottom of the plaque, separated by a line from the official text, was a single additional line. He had requested it himself. The request had gone through 2 administrative offices and come back once with a question about formatting, which he had answered, and then come back approved. The plaque was not heavy, but it had a solidity to it. He held it and looked at it for a moment, and then he put it under his arm and talked to the people who came up afterward, and drank the bad coffee, and stood in the flat November light until the gymnasium was empty and it was time to go. Owen Carr, 3,000 light-years away, was on patrol in a vessel he had been on for 3 weeks and had not fully gotten used to. He was looking out a small viewport at a stretch of space that had no name he knew of, just coordinates. A set of numbers that meant a location without meaning anything else. And the stars at that distance looked the way they always looked, which was very far away and very still and mostly indifferent. His coffee had gone cold. He did not reheat it. He was not thinking about anything in particular. Somewhere in the Keth Dominion, in a war chamber cut from black stone where the temperature was always kept low and the atmospheric processors hummed and the obsidian table had held 600 years of decisions, A council of the most powerful political minds in the known galaxy was sitting very still. Nobody was suggesting they try again.